good to see everyone. Welcome to what's a special live recording, a really neat opportunity for us, a live recording of the SCDC webcast. So if you saw our webcast, this is one of our newer educative platforms where we dive into the weeds on relevant items to enhance our knowledge, our skills, and our abilities, and really just to enhance our collective professional capacities to accelerate economic development in the South. And we all know this, we love to say this, but if you think about it, as SCDC seeks to provide learning opportunities, there are really no better speakers or educators than our members. And think about what you all did just last year. Last year, you developed just a little over $200 billion of new corporate investment. That's incredible. That will create about 250,000 new jobs. So these are the type of members that we have. So these types of platforms are led by our members because there are no better guests to have speak at our things. And you think about what we did last year, equally important. Our people are setting the strategies to perpetuate and accelerate that level of success. And these are some of the things that we like to talk about on these webcasts. So thank you for being here today to all of our guests. And we thank our signature investor, ECS, for making today's session possible. And more importantly, we thank ECS for supporting economic development organizations and professionals all across the South. They are just, people know this, are a really great engineering consulting partner to all of us, including SCDC. And we thank you for your partnership to the team at ECS and for presenting today's webcast. So today's session and topic is a different type of thing, of an item for SCDC, but a really important, timely topic. And it will be specific to EPA actions on emerging contaminants and the impact thereof on due diligence assessments. So we're really happy today to have that type of conversation. And I'm really happy to welcome our guest speaker, Scott Worley, to the webcast. So if you haven't met Scott just yet, I'll read his bio. For 22 years, Scott has been establishing himself as one of the most experienced professional geologists in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill region. Scott separates himself from his peers by holding P&G licenses in 3 states. He's a member of the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council's PFOS team and has taken it upon himself to obtain various licenses that diversify his skill set. Scott is a devoted family man who was there to support his sister during the 1996 Olympics and is now a diehard supporter of his daughter's various sporting pursuits. With a flawless record and a wide range of skills, Scott has the proven ability to accomplish many challenges that he faces, and we're really happy to welcome him to the SCDC webcast. So as we, let me say this too, as we move forward, this will be recorded and we'll put this out on SCDC's various video platforms. So when you see anything that you are picking up today, that will be available to you via video in the coming days. But also, you're welcome to turn your cameras on. You're welcome to ask questions. I hope that's okay, Scott, but let's all take advantage of the time that we have here to just be together and ask questions. And we hope you enjoy this webcast. And Scott, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Matt. What a great introduction, and very thankful to be here this morning with such a great group of people. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. And like you said, yeah, if anybody has a question, feel free to either save it to the end or stop me where I'm at on that slide, and I'll try to answer that question as best I can. All right, so let's see here. Okay, you guys should all be seeing my screen. So yeah, the title of this presentation is PFAS, an emerging group of contaminants. And we'll just go ahead and get started. All right, so what are we going to learn today? We'll talk about, well, I have this entitled Reintroduction to PFAS. I have a feeling that you guys are starting to hear more and more about this these days as it continues to emerge. So if you've heard of it already, it'll be a reintroduction. If you haven't, it'll just be your initial introduction. We'll talk about what PFAS is, some of its chemical properties, how the science has evolved as it's been emerging over the years and decades, I should say. Some recent headlines. We'll touch on potential major sources of these compounds. And then we'll get into a little bit of the EPA PFAS roadmap that was initially published back in 2022. We have a year under our belt now. So we'll touch on some of the accomplishments that was responsible for, and then some of the federal dollars that are coming out of DC to help fund some of this stuff, and a little bit again on potential markets and what's to come. So what is PFAS? PFAS, of course, is an acronym. It stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They're a very large chemical family of at least 4,500 known compounds. However, depending on how you define the acronym PFAS, there may be up to 12,000 or even 6 million compounds that would fall into this category. And there's a lot of chatter right now back and forth on what the final definition on PFAS is going to be. Typically, as you'll see kind of down here, they're chains of carbon atoms surrounded by fluorine atoms. This is the most electronegative bond in nature, and so it's a very strong bond to break. Because of that relationship at the atomic level, it gives these compounds very desirable characteristics, and it's why they've become so common over the years. Some of those characteristics that they include a very strong resistance to water and oil, resistance to corrosion, resistance to biodegradation, and resistance to extreme heat. Like I said, it's one of the strongest chemical bonds in nature. And it reacts and forms compounds with almost all other elements on the periodic table. This is a slide care of one of the laboratories we use to help analyze our PFAS samples that we collect out in the field. The main takeaway here is just kind of showing you how it's emerged over the decades. These compounds were initially developed back in the late 30s. They were discovered by accident up in West Virginia at a DuPont plant, where somebody watering their garden after working a shift at the plant realized that the water was beating up on their sneakers, and hence its resistant to water property was discovered, and from there it just kind of took off. It's really only been emerging, however, in our world and in our industry since maybe like the early to mid 2000s. You can see how it's evolved. Back in 2009, we were looking at only 2 compounds with reporting limits in around 400 to 200 parts per trillion. As we move forward in time to present day, we're talking about potentially 6 million different compounds, and those reporting limits have been driven down to 4 to 20 part per quadrillion range. To give you an analogy or a reference point for how to think about part per trillion versus part per quadrillion, typically when we look at groundwater or doing a groundwater assessment on a site for chlorinated solvents or petroleum compounds, we're looking in the part per billion range, micrograms per liter. Part per trillion range, the laboratory instruments need to be much more sensitive to detect down to those levels. Some people refer to 1 part per trillion as an equivalent to about 1 drop of water in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Now, where we are in current day in part per quadrillion range, that's more equivalent to about 2.5 minutes during the entire Earth's geological time scale of 4.5 billion years. So it's kind of hard to fathom, but hopefully that puts that into some sort of perspective for you. Some PFAS in recent headlines. Some of you may have seen or heard recently that the EPA is proposing to set a maximum contaminant level for PFAS in drinking water. That MCL that's been proposed is for two specific compounds, the original two that were targeted. Those are PFOA and PFOS. And that proposed limit is 4 parts per trillion. They're also going to be taking a look at a handful of other PFAS compounds to be regulated in drinking water. And those comparison criteria are going to be calculated via a hazard index calculation. We've already started to begin doing that on some of the drinking water studies that we're conducting in North Carolina. So what are some potential major sources of these compounds? That's important to know. Of course, the industries that are making this compound, the primary chemical manufacturing facilities, they're going to be one of the major sources, right? There's no question about that. Following in close second, the secondary manufacturing facilities that use those raw PFAS compounds in their products that they're manufacturing, and or in their manufacturing processes. So for metal finishing and plating, industrial surfactants, paper products and packaging, cable and wiring, semiconductor and photolithography industries, and textiles, leather, apparel, carpet, and furniture industries are all examples of possible secondary manufacturing facilities that could be a potential major source. Of course, military installations, AFFF training or use sites. AFFF, that's an acronym for aqueous film forming foam, more commonly known as aqueous firefighting foam. That is one major source of PFAS that is well documented. And also the wastewater industry and resultant biosolids that are produced by treating that water. And of course, landfill leachate. All these products that contain PFAS, even residential waste that goes to like residential landfills, lined landfills, all those products have PFAS in them. The conditions in a landfill tend to leach the PFAS out of those products. And so that landfill leachate has been documented to be a highly concentrated source of PFAS compounds. All right, so let's talk about the EPA PFAS roadmap and some of the progress over the last year since it went into an existence. A year of progress. November 2022 marked about a year since the roadmap was published. Some of the things that it has accomplished, it's proposed to designate the 2 PFAS as CERCLA hazardous substances. Those 2 PFAS, again, are PFOA and PFOS. If finalized, that's going to be a critical step toward increasing the transparency around releases of PFAS. And it will allow the EPA to hold polluters accountable for cleaning up their contamination. It has released drinking water health advisories, acting in accordance with the EPA's mission to protect public health and keep communities and public health authorities informed when new science becomes available. The agency issued drinking water health advisories for 4 PFAS compounds. It laid the foundation for enhancing data on PFAS. It included a national PFAS testing strategy, requiring companies to conduct PFAS testing, and nationwide sampling for 29 PFAS compounds in drinking water starting in 2023. That is all stuff we'll talk about a little bit more that is related to the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule number 5, which will continue, that study will continue to go on through 2025. One difference between it and its one of its predecessors, the UCMR3, or the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule number 3, back when that was in occurrence, they were only looking at wastewater treatment facilities or water treatment plants that serviced customers, that serviced 10,000 or more customers. And it only looked at a handful of PFAS compounds. This new iteration of it, the UCMR number 5, is looking at water treatment facilities that service 3,300 customers or more, and is looking at a total of 29 PFAS compounds. So quite a big change there. It's going to be more far-reaching and bring in way more data to chug, so the EPA can start making informed decisions on next steps. Also, the government has began distributing $10 billion in funding to address emerging contaminants under the bipartisan infrastructure law, also known as BILL. There's lots of dollars coming out of DC right now, funding assessment, facility and infrastructure upgrades to water treatment plants, because the number one way that we can be exposed to PFAS, at least the data shows that it's via our drinking water. So that's where we're being exposed to it the most. And so that's what they're trying to rectify the quickest. And then also they translated the latest science into EPA's cross-agency PFAS efforts. This included updating EPA's contaminated site tables and developing new PFAS methods, and conducting toxicity assessments. One of the reasons why you see more data and more advisories for certain PFAS compounds like PFOA and PFOS is because that's where the most toxicological research has been done. As more and more toxicology gets published, we'd expect to see if there are severe health concerns or they're determined to be carcinogenic, we'd expect to see more and more compound-specific comparison criteria published for those specific compounds. Some more key accomplishments. They enhanced chemical safety by instituting that national PFAS testing strategy. They removed several PFAS from the safer chemicals ingredient list, and also removed 12 PFAS from the approved list of inert ingredients for pesticides. Those accomplishments are a little bit misleading. A lot of the PFAS that were removed from the safer chemical ingredient list were already kind of phased out, at least in the United States, from being utilized. And the 12 PFAS that were removed from the list of inert ingredients for pesticides really had already been phased out as well. Pesticides were just one other potential major source that the EPA was looking at, but some research that's come out recently that I've read indicates that the PFAS may not have been in the product, the pesticide product itself, but may have over time leached from the plastic containers the pesticides are being contained into that product. So still a lot of research going on where this is being utilized, what products it's in. It's not always in the product. Sometimes it's coming from the product packaging. Another accomplishment is safeguarding the drinking water. I just touched on this a tiny bit, that UCMR 5. It's going to run from 2023 through 2025. We're looking at 29 compounds in this iteration rather than just I think 4. This data, like I said, it's going to be critical in assessing the prevalence of PFAS in America's potable water supply, and allow efforts to reduce PFAS levels in drinking water, and enable the EPA to better determine if and where PFAS contamination is disproportionately impacting communities with environmental justice concerns. I'm sure you know that the federal administration is pushing forward on that front very hard. And that kind of ties into all this new ESG terminology and stuff that you're probably hearing in the news as well. Ensuring clean water. They are going to leverage the Clean Water Act. How are they going to do that? They're going to use the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System program, which does include enforceable effluent limitation guidelines. Industrial users, anybody that's pumping and treating groundwater where there may be a contaminant or an incident has occurred there in the past, you likely have a NPDES permit that you need to comply with. They are going to start writing the requirement for PFAS sampling into those permits. So it's going to be an additional sample that will have to be collected, an additional analysis that the lab will have to run. And so that's going to help cut down on potential point sources of PFAS discharges. And cleaning up contamination. Something big and important for you all to know about is that those two compounds we keep talking about, PFOA and PFOS, have been proposed as hazardous substances under CERCLA, also known as Superfund. If they do get, if that proposal does get put on the books, and they are in fact deemed hazardous substances, that's going to give the EPA some teeth to direct cleanup of those hazardous substances. They've also developed some regional screening levels for 5 PFAS compounds to help inform site cleanup decisions where voluntary cleanups are going on or where cleanups are going on federal installations. RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, added 4 PFAS as hazardous constituents, excuse me. This will ensure that they're subject to corrective action requirements. And that modification would clarify that emerging contaminants such as PFAS can be cleaned up through the RCRA corrective action process. There are new analytical methods being developed. The new method that you'll hear a lot about is draft method 1633. It is going to report 40 different compounds rather than that method's predecessor, which was known as isotope dilution, which reported 29 compounds. So as things continue to emerge, the science continues to evolve, our lab capabilities are able to analyze down to much lower levels. They're also going to start reporting additional compounds. They've started some toxicity assessment for Gen X. A lot of work has been being done on that as a result of the Chemours facility in the Fayetteville region of North Carolina. If you haven't heard of Gen X, it was the compound that was initially modified by 3M when DuPont up in West Virginia developed the PFOA and started realizing that there may be some health concerns related with that compound. They started talking about, well, can we change this to make it safer? And some, I think the internal research that they were doing resulted in questionable results. And so they just decided to stick with the initial compound, C8 or PFOA. However, 3M picked it up and they were using that at their Chemours facility in the Fayetteville region, and they coined that compound name as Gen X. You'll hear a lot about that if you're in or around North Carolina. And they're doing a lot more remediation studies, right? You know, we're assessing for this a lot. We are doing a lot of remediation, but the remediation technologies need to improve, right? Because a lot of the times when we're remediating the media, it's just creating more contaminated media. For instance, some of the best ways to treat water are via activated carbon, ion exchange, or filtering via like reverse osmosis. But all 3 of those processes result in either impacted activated carbon that then needs to be dealt with, concentrated leachate from the reverse osmosis system that needs to be degraded or disposed of somehow, or having to deal with the spent resin exchange and reactivating that for future use. And during that process, you create a concentrated leachate form of PFAS. So there's more technologies, lots of research being done on that front for remediation. Thermal treatment studies, you know, it takes a lot of energy to break that carbon fluorine bond. So they're really trying to think outside the box on how can we develop some sort of sustainable PFAS remediation technology. And one of their accomplishments also is holding polluters accountable. In January 2022, EPA issued information requests letters to 3 major PFAS manufacturers, Chemours, like I just mentioned, Corteva and DuPont de Nemours. And those letters required those companies to provide information on their current and past PFAS production and management and disposal practices at 24 different facilities. So, and then also in November 2022, they issued an administrative order and of consent to 3M that requires 3M to offer to sample and provide treatment for PFAS contamination in drinking water near 3M's facility in Cordova, Illinois. There's also a lot of that going on around the Chemours facility in North Carolina. And we'll see a slide later on that shows you some of the sampling that they're doing. So how are they going to address all these items that they've written into the roadmap? One way they're going to get there is by addressing it with all the federal dollars coming out of that bipartisan infrastructure law. Right here, you know, I won't go through all the numbers, but you can just see these large amount of dollars that are being set aside to help drinking water states with their drinking water supply. Especially in disadvantaged municipalities. And so a lot of that's also going to be not just cleaning the PFAS out of our water, but upgrading our water treatment facilities to allow them to have the right technology to remove the PFAS, which will allow them to hopefully get below that 4 part per trillion maximum contaminant level that's been proposed. A little more about the budget and how we're going to pay for all this. You know, our president's Biden's fiscal year 2023 budget proposed an increase of $51 billion for EPA's PFAS work. And that's primarily going to be for transformational upgrades to our nation's drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure. So there's going to be a lot of work being done on that front over the next years to come. More than $5 billion of those dollars going to be set aside to deal with legacy pollution at those federal installations, Superfund sites, brownfield sites, anything owned by the federal government, including military installations and bases around the country. So here it kind of breaks it down a little more. Talks about a set aside of $10 billion from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, $5 billion for small and disadvantaged communities, drinking water grants, $1 billion a year for 5 years, $4 billion for drinking water state revolving funds over 5 years, and $1 billion for clean water state revolving fund over 5 years. If you want to learn more about those, there are some links here you can research and learn more about how those dollars are planned to be spent. So what potential markets may have to be dealing with this more than some others? So under the PFAS Act, FEMA will develop a plan to reduce and eliminate exposure to PFAS from AFFF and personal protective equipment. One thing that's been in the news a lot lately are our firefighters. Not only are they being exposed to these chemicals through the foam that they're using to put out very intense hot fires, because that foam, in effect, what it does is it creates a blanket, a film over the fire and smothers it, like a normal blanket would do for a small fire. That's the film forming foam. But then also their personal protective equipment they wear, or all their turnout gear, it has high concentrations of PFAS in it. So there's a lot of research going into how can they reduce the concentrations of PFAS in the firefighting foam that's already occurring, and also how can they reduce the amount of PFAS in their turnout gear that still provides them protection without as high a likelihood of having health effects from wearing it. TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, is proposing to require reporting on PFAS manufactured in the country. So if you've manufactured or imported PFAS chemicals in any year since 2011, you may have to report information regarding your usage, including but not limited to uses, produced volumes, your disposal practices, exposures that occurred to your workforce, and any other hazards that you may know about. The toxics release inventory. So if you're not familiar with that, this is something that a lot of industry need to deal with. And it's more geared towards air emissions. We do know that, PFAS can be emitted through industrial smokestacks, steam stacks. It's in the effluent discharge into the air and the water. They also have spills, so there's many different ways that industry can wind up having to deal with this. So TRI kind of regulates that. It requires industry to report how much of certain compounds they're using on an annual basis. Currently for PFAS, the threshold was 100 pounds. And there is a de minimis exemption of 0.1% for PFOA and 1% for all other PFAS. However, last year, out of 30,000 industries, only 39 reported. And because of that, EPA is proposing to get rid of that de minimis exemption. So I'd imagine that if that occurs, there's going to be a lot more industries that are required to report. UCMR, we talked about that quite a bit already. It's tightening the screws and making everybody, any POTW serving greater than 3,300 customers, participate in that study. And it's, another kind of trivia thing for you to know is that it's the first time that the same chemicals were re-included on a subsequent UCMR study. And there we have it. I misspoke earlier. I said 4. So back in UCMR 3, there were 6 PFAS compounds. Now we're looking at 29. 6 of those 29 are similar between UCMR 3 and 5. And they're looking down to lower standards, right? The laboratory analytical equipment has become more sensitive. Effluent limitation guidelines. This ties back into those National Pollution Discharge Elimination System permits that are going to become not only at the federal level, but states are beginning to write some of that into their permits as well. The monitoring that's being done when we're going out and collecting samples these days, we're running a new laboratory method, 1633, where we're looking at 40 compounds rather than 29 by the old isotope dilution method. So the program will enable the EPA to gather info on sources and quantities of PFAS discharges, and they're going to use that data to inform their next decisions, right? They need to make informed decisions. So these studies, these NPDES, all the data being generated by the NPDES permit compliance sampling, all the data being generated by these unregulated contaminant monitoring rules, they're taking all that into account so that we can make the next best informed decision with that data that's been collected. And like I said, the EPA is starting to issue guidance to states to include the requirement for PFAS sampling in their permits as well. So it's coming. The effluent guidelines program, program plan 15. These are just different things that they're planning to do with timelines to get them accomplished by. They're proposing limits on PFAS for the chemical, plastics, and synthetic fiber manufacturers to be put in place by June 24. They're planning on expanding some textile studies that have been occurring and have that completed by June 2025. They're revising effluent limitation guidelines for the landfills category, hopefully by June 2025. And that may come a little quicker than that. I know, for instance, in North Carolina, certain states are being more aggressive For example, in North Carolina, come July 1st, 2023, this year, there's a requirement that is going to begin that's going to require them to, all landfills, to sample their surface water, groundwater, leachate for PFAS. That requirement has never existed before. That's going into effect July 1. Not pursuing further action for electrical and electronic components category until June 2025. They're kind of putting that on the shelf and focusing more of their efforts on drinking water and toxicology in landfills, other potential major sources. They're going to continue to monitor PFAS use and discharges from some other major potential source categories like the pulp and paper and paperboard industries and airports. It's good to remember that airports are almost their own small local governments. And so they have their own, law enforcement department. They also have their own fire fighting department. And so you'll find at a lot of airports, there's been a lot of firefighting training that's occurred over the years, similar to what you would see on a military installation. This other category, leather, tanning, finishing, paint, formulating, and plastics molding categories, December 2026. So you can kind of see how they're prioritizing who they're going to go after in the major potential source categories. Here we go. We continue wastewater treatment plants, biosolids, agriculture. Through the wastewater treatment process, similar to that landfill leachate process, the PFAS compounds are being concentrated. What's left is that biosolid material. Back in the day, we were all told in the environmental industry that the best way to get rich quick is to find a use for somebody's waste. And so when they started applying biosolids, it's been going on for decades now. It was a great reuse of our waste until we learned about this emerging compound that's been concentrated in the biosolids. So there's lots of regulation coming out in different states that are ahead of the game, even further ahead than EPA are. Just recently read an article where Maine is going to be banning the use of PFAS. They've already banned the use of biosolids application, but they're going to be banning the use of it completely by 2030. And in Minnesota, they have an even more aggressive timeline of banning that by 2025. So lots of wastewater treatment plants, municipalities, they're scrambling, trying to figure out what they're going to do with all their biosolids, because there are a lot of them. The PFAS MCLs, of course, again, drinking water is the number one way we can be exposed to this right now. And they do have that proposal out to make that MCL 4 part per trillion for PFOA and PFOS. And I do know for here in North Carolina, like we said, the DEQ has already began working with the public water systems throughout the state to assess PFAS levels in their drinking water. Here, this next slide, I think this is the final slide. This was a NCDEQ slide that I stole from one of their slideshows, and I wanted to share with the group. It's fairly specific it is specific to the state of North Carolina. You can see this area here in green, Chemours. You've heard me mention that name a few times throughout this presentation. They're the ones that were primarily using Gen X in their industrial process. This is a pretty big area right here in this green area. And the pop out here with all these yellow and red dots, I don't know if you can read this, but they illustrate thousands of residences that have been tested and proven to require additional water filtration due to high PFAS levels. So you can imagine how much this is costing Chemours to do this. And then you can see just some other testing that's gone on around the state. and this slide has some age on it now. This was created in 2020. If they produced a new map these days with all the data they've been receiving, you'd probably see a lot more dots on here, and it'd probably be hard to make out the state of North Carolina. And that wraps it up for my slideshow. I hope you guys learned something. I'd be glad to try and answer any questions that anybody has today.
Hi, this is Jana in Albany, Georgia. As part of the services that your team offers, you mentioned that this is something that's included or can be included with some of the work that's being done. When we're looking at sites, what are some things that we need to be mindful of, or, from a community's perspective as we look at these new contaminants and looking at getting some of the work completed for our community?
Yeah, so we can certainly assess for PFAS. A lot of times in a due diligence capacity, we're assessing for multiple different things depending on what the sources are, either on the site or nearby the site. You're going to want to, typically, in a due diligence capacity, it's gonna get flagged in a phase 1 environmental site assessment report if the subject property or areas around that subject property are potentially major sources of PFAS or major targets that the EPA has identified as potential sources of PFAS. In the new phase 1 environmental site assessment standard, the 21 standard that did go into effect, we're still in some kind of grace period, so where you can still use the old 13 standard, I think maybe up through February of 2024 until it fully expires. But that new standard has gone into effect, and it does address PFAS as a business environmental risk. I think it will continue to do that until that time when the EPA's proposal to designate PFOA and PFOS as a hazardous substance goes into effect. At that point, then it will likely, I'd assume, would no longer just be a business environmental risk, but would be a recognized environmental condition. Does that answer your question at all, Jana?
Definitely. Thank you. I'm glad to know that it's in the phase 1 series that we would notify or identify this.
Yeah, when you're dealing with your consultant or your contact at ECS, let them know that you want to use the new 21 phase 1 ESA standard. You'll find if somebody is selecting the old 13 standard, it just completely disregards PFAS. And so you may come across certain sellers looking to provide you a phase 1 completed under the former phase 1 standard to try and mask any potential issues associated with PFAS. So something for you to be aware of. Green, did you have a question?
No, sir. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, this is Missy Kendrick. I'm in Rome, Georgia, and I think hearing the presentation, which was great today, you think you know a little bit about PFAS, but what I've seen today is kind of scary, not just for our communities, but for even a lot of manufacturers in our communities, and how some of the small manufacturers that will have these PFAS chemicals, how they're going to be required to report in the future. But going back to what Janice said, is it seems like phase 1 might flag PFAS for maybe brownfields. How about green fields? I didn't hear you say anything about any agricultural chemicals or anything like that. Do you think it's going to show up on greenfield sites as well?
Certainly agricultural sites. Because of the prolific biosolid application and spray irrigation that's gone on over the past few decades, that is being looked at as a potential major source. what's kind of interesting too, a lot of times are, in communities that utilize surface water as their drinking water supply sources, a lot of times those reservoirs are in more of the rural parts of the counties, and they're surrounded by farm fields. And a lot of those farm fields have had biosolid application occur on them for a long time. So we think that may be one of the major sources that's getting into our drinking water supply. However, there's been even more research and data recently that's indicating that may not be the #1 contributor. It may be things such as septic tanks in residential communities that are more rural and not connected to the municipal sewer line, just due to all of the common everyday products we use as consumers going down our plumbing and into our septic tank, into our groundwater, and into nearby reservoirs that feed our water supply. So, and one other thing that's really important to know when we're talking about PFAS, it's pretty ubiquitous, right? It's everywhere in nature. They've tested the blood of polar bears in the North Pole. It has PFAS in their blood. When this first started to emerge back in West Virginia, the DuPont plant, it's my understanding that, they were trying to figure out how bad the problem was. They kept stepping out further and further, more and more properties away from their industrial plant and testing soil and groundwater, and they kept finding it. They went down gradient, found it. They went up gradient, they found it. And so what they determined was it's not just getting into the groundwater and flowing down gradient. It is, escaping via their air emissions. It's getting into the atmosphere. It's being redeposited during precipitation events, and it's all over the planet. So, and then they started testing people's blood, and they had to go back to a Korean War veterans, or not veteran, somebody that was coming into the military, doing his pre-screening meds, getting blood samples taken. They had to go back that far in order to find a sample of human blood that didn't have PFAS in it. So does that answer your question at all? Did I forget?
Well, it does, but it really just kind of makes me question why manufacturers are going to be required to, if it's everywhere, it seems like manufacturers and industries might be being targeted more when it actually might not be just them.
Right. Yeah. I think, as with anything, right, they're gonna try to go after the major sources first. That's where they're going to get the most bang for their buck, the most progress in dealing with this problem. So, but I agree, because of its ubiquitous, and there's so many different potential sources and uses of these compounds. So many different types of industries are using them. They're going to have to do it in some kind of tiered approach and prioritize who they're going after. And so that's where that EPA roadmap kind of comes into play and describes, and it kind of shows EPA's hand to some degree as to what they're thinking, where they want to be, and how they're going to get there.
And I'm going to make one more comment, and then I promise to hush. But it seems like basically that every phase 1 then is basically going to kick it to a phase 2.
No, it should not. I see what you're saying, but I think that where that's going to occur is going to be when there's potential major sources around. For instance, I came across a phase 1 came across my desk the other day. Our subject site was kind of on top of a hill, but or side gradient to an industrial facility that was a major welding facility. And because it was adjacent, or there's just one road separating the two sites, it did get flagged as a business environmental risk, because we know, especially very large welding operations like that, most likely we're using PFAS as a fume suppressant. because in the welding process, it creates a lot of fumes. So they were using that as an engineering control, but we don't know where that was going or what was happening to it. So it did get called out as a business environmental risk, and based upon our client's adversity to risk, he asked that we go and not only address the other RECs that were called out, because there were others, but he also wanted us to sample for PFAS. Some of the things we got to do out in the field to make sure that the data we're collecting is good quality defensible data is by taking additional steps, quality assurance, quality control steps out in the field. We always throw 2 environmental professionals at it and follow the suit of the NCDEQ, which recommends a clean hands, dirty hands sampling approach. It can really cut down on the potential for cross-contamination, not only from sample to sample, but from sampler to sample, just based on the types of things that we may be wearing. ECS has a do's and don'ts PFAS checklist. There's certain things like sunscreen, bug spray, food that you just can't have on your site. You have to have a staging area where if you have to eat, it needs to be done in the staging area. We need to continually change gloves, really be careful with the types of products and disposables or expendables that we're using to collect the samples that we're collecting. So for instance, we have to source all high density polyurethane materials, stuff that's known to be PFAS free. We have to order PFAS free certified water from the laboratory we're ordering our sample kits from, so we can use that certified PFAS free water and take equipment blanks out in the field. So we run that water over, under, and through the equipment that we're using to collect our samples. And then we have that water analyzed. It's a good check to make sure that the data we're collecting is good data and we can hang our hat on it. We didn't affect the laboratory result based on anything we were wearing or eating that day. So those are some of the extra steps that go into the assessment. I may have lost track there, but I think that's important for you guys to note too. It's not just going out and collecting it's not just 3 boreholes in a cloud of dust, like you may have heard consultants refer to before as blowing in some wells, collecting some groundwater samples and having them analyzed. We have to go through, there's a lot more project management involved in extra QA, QC steps because it's so ubiquitous.
Hey, Missy, this is Raul Peralta with ECS. I think you bring up an important point, and that is those economic development organizations, and I think most of you do, that offer services in support of the existing industry would be wise to consider bringing this topic up to your existing industries, not as a way to alarm them, because that's certainly not our purpose, nor do we think it should be yours, but simply to begin the conversation so that if and when this moves forward as a regulatory issue, if it ever does that, then it will not take anyone by surprise, and you and your organization are in fact on the cutting edge of anticipating what may need to be a conversation in the future, if that makes sense.
It does, and I think that's kind of where some of my worry is, because if you find a business environmental risk and it kicks it to a phase 2 for PFAS, you're gonna find PFAS. So then is that gonna be a liability for this neighboring industry or this welding shop that they're gonna have to come in and clean up PFAS before that site can be marketed?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'll let Scott answer that from a technical perspective. But again, we're in my humble opinion, we're in the beginning stages of what this means, how the EPA is going to treat it, what the limits are going to be, if they're going to set some. So right now, I think the best thing to do is to keep ourselves informed, read about it, maybe share some some information with your existing industries. And just be aware that it may be an issue coming up in the future. We just don't know yet. Scott, please correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I'd echo a lot of what you said, Raul. And I do think that like a lot of different contaminants before PFAS have done, they could end up establishing some kind of national background level that screens a lot of sites out from having to perform any kind of corrective action. But these are all really good questions, Missy, and they're the same types of questions that we're wanting to have answered. And like Raul said, I think what we can do now is just kind of try and stay in front of it, try and stay up to date with the new policy changes. We're trying to do that by participating in trade groups like the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council. That is a group of industry affiliate partners, which ECS is, but also regulators from all 50 states and U.S. territories, other interested parties like university professors and just citizens. And it's a big group of people, and they're writing lots of guidance documents right now, lots of fact sheets as it relates to different industries and targets and PFAS. And we also, I'm in an ad hoc committee for emerging compounds at the North Carolina Manufacturers Alliance, also trying to track it from a state regulatory perspective there. They're really plugged in with the Science Advisory Board and the Environmental Management Commission that at the end of the day writes policies which affect our regulations. So we're trying to stay in front of it and stay on top of it by staying plugged into groups like that.
Understood. Thank you both.
Scott, I'm coming at this at a little bit different perspective because what brought me to this call was we have a project that is looking at a site in our area, and one of the things they informed us of was they would be storing PFAS on their site to be used in their manufacturing process. And we kind of made the presumption that it's going to be considered a hazardous chemical. And we didn't know if we needed to alert our county administrators and municipal administrations that, hey, this project is going to come in and they're going to have hazardous chemicals on site. What are the concerns with that? And did we need to come up with local ordinances or anything, local regulations? Or can we say, hey, look, don't worry about it. It's EPA. They're going to be monitoring that. It's part of the permit processes. They'll be sure to be within boundaries or limitations or anything like that. So can you offer anything in terms of how do we address the concerns of new companies that will utilize PFAS in the future?
Yeah, very good question. I think if that proposal to designate PFOA and PFOS gets approved and they're designated as hazardous substances, I'd imagine that they would be dealt with no differently than other hazardous substances. So, there's going to be lots of reporting that they need to do as, a potential small or large quantity generator of hazardous waste. There's some of those other programs that I talked about in my slideshow, like the TRI, the Toxic Release Inventory. So if they're probably going to have to report and go into some kind of database to comply with that rule. And then as the EPA gathers that data, they know they're a user, they're using that in their process, so many pounds of it on an annual basis. There'll be additional hoops that they may need to jump through. They may need to apply for an industrial user's permit to the local POTW and institute their own PFAS monitoring program or pre-treatment program that where, on a monthly basis, they're taking influent and effluent samples to make sure that their pre-treatment process is working prior to discharging to the local wastewater treatment plant. Those types of things are likely going to occur with those types of industries. And that's probably just the tip of the iceberg. There's probably going to be a lot more to it than that. What
Okay.
that will all be,
Very
though, I'm just not the expert on that front.
That's okay. Hey, I learned a lot from this, so I appreciate you, your input today.
Thank you, Gus. If any of you guys are interested and happen to have Netflix, and I don't know that you need to have Netflix. I think you could probably search this up and watch it on YouTube as well. But there's a really good Netflix documentary out there that gives you more of the background on Ground Zero up in West Virginia. It's called The Devil We Know. And I strongly suggest you all check that out. It's a good, I don't know, maybe it's an hour and a half long. I can't remember. But it's a really good documentary that I highly recommend. I don't know that it's rated, but it is an emotional roller coaster ride. And there are some kind of images that may not be too pleasant to look at on it, but there's not a whole lot of that. It's just a good educational documentary with how this emerged from Ground Zero in West Virginia. Are there any other questions?
Well, Scott and ECS team, thank you so much. I mean, this was a really great and a really important webinar. So thank you all for the questions too, and just engaging in some dialogue. I think this is great data for us to take back to our existing industry, like a conversation we had. Also great information pieces and data that can inform our go forward strategies. So thank you so much.